Sorry, America. I'm going to move you because I'm going to keep running into it. You guys want to say the pledge? All right, so this class starts in period 1. Period 1 makes up 5% of the exam. So when we're thinking about the types of questions that we could get on period 1 content, in general, we're probably going to see some multiple choice questions. There's a possibility that there could be an SAQ on period 1, but only in the section where you have 2 possible SAQs to choose from. So as far as the written portion of the test, long essays, SAQs, it is really unlikely that you'll have to write on period 1, but there is some knowledge that we could take into the test from period 1 that we could potentially use on the long essays to earn that kind of extra point, the whole complex understanding. So we'll talk about some of those connections that you can make. So when we look at period 1, we go from prehistory to about 8,000 BCE. All right, in our kind of first phase of period 1. All right, in this phase, people are semi-nomadic. Right, most of their time they're spending looking for food. So we have nomads. The packet uses the term foragers. So forager is just somebody that's hunting around looking for food. The occupation that most people were doing at this time was just that, searching for food. When food sources were plentiful, people would settle for times, and I think that's kind of a misconception. As soon as you have that, nomads were always moving, and it's like they got up and they felt compelled to just move. That's not the case. Nomads and foragers were looking for food, and when they found reliable food sources, they would stay. So there were definitely generations of people in prehistory that settled, at least in some form, but the issue was they didn't know how to cultivate or domesticate food, so once the natural supply ran out, that they could replace that. So, this period of nomadism was a period where, again, people would settle as long as they could, but then they would move. In general, there's a lot of equality during this period. The groups that people lived in were relatively small, right? You would travel in a group that was only as big as you were able to provide food. In general, women would have one child, and then it wasn't until that child was somewhat self-sufficient that they would even think about having another one. So, these little groups that they lived in were pretty small. There wasn't the gender division that we're going to see later in this course, because men and women were both really necessary economically. Right? And that's kind of a common theme in this course. When women are more necessary economically, they're going to have more rights. So when we talk about period 2, and we talk about the Greek city-states, we'll talk about the city-state of Sparta. And the Spartans, they were warriors, and they were often out waging war, and they needed women to take care of the home front. So in Sparta, women were relatively equal to men. And that's a common theme. The Mongols, they moved, and women had responsibilities, not just for food production and not just for taking care of the family, but also responsibilities in war. And so Mongol women had more rights. So it will be kind of a repeated theme of the class that we'll kind of try to touch each time there's something noteworthy to talk about with women. It would be a great continuity and change essay about the rights and roles of women. So it's something that we, again, keep in the back of our minds, and we will, just kind of look at that as we go. So in addition to this, during this time of prehistory, people are polytheistic. Is this marker showing up for you guys all the way in the back? And is the size okay? All right, so in general, at this earliest time, people are using religion to answer questions that they can't answer, right? And that, kind of approach to religion won't really start to shift until we get into period 2. we'll talk a little bit about the Greco-Roman philosophers who were starting to ask and answer their own questions outside of religion. But during prehistory, people were coming up with creation myths. They were trying to explain how they got here, and there was all these kind of wild stories about, the role that the gods played in the formation of the world. Again, when there was bad weather, it was clear that the gods were unhappy. So there was a lot of sacrifice to the gods taking place. In this earliest period of the class, there's not a lot of evidence of human sacrifice because there just weren't a lot of people living in these groups together. So, in the next period of the course, when we talk about the settled people, especially in the Americas, human sacrifice becomes common, and we'll talk about why that was utilized. 8,000 is when things start to change. So 8,000 BCE, this is where we start to see settled agriculture develop. And we kind of assume that this happened by accident. There's a lot of historical debate about which was the first group of people that started to develop settled agriculture. There's evidence of settled civilizations all the way back to about 8,000 BCE in Egypt. And kind of all throughout the world, there's different periods of time where people settle. In the quote-unquote Fertile Crescent in the Middle East, we see settled agriculture right around 3,000 BCE, right? So about 5,000 years ago. So as people start to settle, one of the big things they have to figure out is how to manage water. And also how to use fire, right? And the use of fire is a technological tool that carries over from prehistory, right? But an ability to manage fire is going to give you, kind of all sorts of uses. Obviously, we know it's going to give light. You could cook. You could clear fields a lot easier with fire once you start to settle. But this idea of water management is going to be a real challenge for the earliest people. So what do? They settle close to water, right? And the river valley civilizations are really our first settled civilizations. So they're in the Tigris and the Euphrates in modern day Iraq and Iran. They're in the Indus River Valley in India. They're along the Nile. So to kind of overcome that need to manage water, it's like, well, let's just get where there is water and it's going to be easier to irrigate. So we start to see the establishment of some civilizations. And just like everything, historians like to put things in really neat boxes so it's easy for us to differentiate like a group of people from a civilization. So once civilizations kind of started to develop, we have now looked and said, okay, what are some characteristics that make something a civilization? We said, more than anything, there has to be some sort of established government, right? If you're going to be a civilization, you need a government. And one of the things that the governments will do is they will, at times, force specialized labor, right? And your ability to manage labor is going to become a real challenging thing in these earliest civilizations, right? It's now not just farmers. You need people doing other things. So at times, governments are going to be responsible for doing that, again, that management of labor. Governments are going to be responsible for managing over surplus. Right, now that we have, there's, I think, more chairs in the back, and now that we have surplus, people can trade it, they can store it, but there's got to be a way to manage over that. So having a government is one marker of a civilization, having surplus is another. Having a writing system becomes a key way to differentiate a civilization from a group of people. With writing systems, governments are able to track tax records, track history, come up with calendars. That's another thing. We don't think about a calendar as like this piece of like monumental technology, but an ability to track time in a sensible way so that way you could prepare for events, that's going to be really powerful tool. The development and use of science and art is another marker of civilization, right? Once people have specialized, they're able to develop some early science, they're able to do some art. And if you really want to be a civilization, you got to build big things, right? That shows that you can cultivate labor, so that's where we start to see, the ziggurats in Mesopotamia, or in Mesoamerica, pardon me. We start to see pyramids in Egypt. We start to see these big, massive structures, built by the earliest civilizations. I don't know if you guys have ever, seen the massive stone heads that were constructed by the Olmecs, but, more than, 10 or 20 feet tall. They weigh tons. They're made of a stone that's not found where the stone heads have been found. So it means someone had to go and find that massive stone and move it and carve it. And that ability to, move labor and have people do what you want them to do is another marker of that earliest civilization. So we'll just really quickly look at two of the earliest civilizations just to kind of highlight some things about them. In Mesopotamia, they had the Tigris and the Euphrates River, and they were really unpredictable. So they would flood certain times a year, but it was never the same time of year. So it was really tough for them to manage over that. So it was tough to sustain like one big civilization. So in Mesopotamia, we had kind of smaller city-states. And even though we use the term Mesopotamia, and it makes it sound like we're describing one like kind of constant group, it was really more broken into cities. So Babylon, Samaria, like these were all Mesopotamian cities. And each one had their own type of government. They had, slightly different economies to them. They had different law codes. In one city, this is where we see the formation of Hammurabi's code. Hammurabi was a Babylonian king, and he came up with a consistent law code. And what he would do is every time there was a crime that he had a rule on, he then took his ruling and made that into his code. So then if he had to rule on the same thing, again, he would be able to be consistent. People have boiled this down to the whole notion of an eye for an eye. It's not quite that simple. There was social class difference in Hammurabi's code. There was wealth difference. So if we were in the same social position, then yeah, sure, it was an eye for an eye. But if you were in a higher social class than I was, well, it might be my eye for your $10, right? So, it's very easy to say, okay, Hammurabi's code, eye for an eye, sounds really fair, really, easy to manage it that way, but it's a little bit more complicated. So the earliest people in Mesopotamia, they were polytheists. They had kind of a bleak view of the afterlife. They just kind of thought that everybody died and everybody went to the same afterlife. It wasn't a reward, it wasn't a punishment, it was just where everybody went. So whether you were king or whether you were a commoner, you died and you went to the same afterlife where everybody was in service of the gods in that afterlife. Bless you. So for the Mesopotamians, that kind of unpredictable nature of life because of, because of the rivers flooding unpredictably, and because of the fact that Mesopotamia did not have a lot of natural barriers, they were frequently invaded. So their unpredictable life led them to view life as something that should be cherished while you have it. And it's like, we're not going to live for the afterlife, we're going to live for this life. And I'm not sure how much like your individual teachers focused on the Epic of Gilgamesh, or if you guys did that at all, but that is a Mesopotamian epic that is really gives us some great insight into the way that the Babylonians lived. And in the Epic of Gilgamesh, you have your main character who's on this quest for immortality. And he's just like determined that he's going to find a way to be immortal. And throughout his whole quest, people keep telling him, just live life to the fullest. Like, you just have to do the best you can with what you have. And I won't ruin the book for you because I know you're all going to run home and read it, and I don't want to ruin the end. But it is an epic quest where, again, he keeps getting that advice, so live it to the fullest. There are definitely commonalities between Egypt and Mesopotamia. The polytheism is a clear one. But that's really where it kind of ends. Because in Egypt, their rivers, the Nile, it was really predictable. So the government was easily able to plan for the flooding and utilize the flooding as an advantage. So life in Egypt was a bit easier. They had great natural barriers. So they had the Nile River protecting one of their borders. They had the Red Sea protecting the other one, so they weren't constantly being invaded. And the Egyptians were able to kind of make the decision on how much they were going to interact with the people around them versus Mesopotamia, where they really had no control of how much they were going to interact. The Egyptians were pretty centralized. Now, there is about 3,000 years of history of an Egyptian civilization, so it's hard to capture all of it in like one word, but in general, they're centralized. In general, the Egyptians didn't try to do a lot of conquest until the most modern period. Now, it's a little confusing because like New Kingdom, Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom are like the three names for the Egyptian periods. But the one closest to us in history is when the Egyptians decide they're going to try to do some conquest. And that's where things kind of go off track for them because they make the classic mistake of just overexpanding. So in Egypt, one of the things was their afterlife was viewed as a reward. And that afterlife was completely controlled by the pharaoh. All right, the pharaoh was the Egyptian king. All right, and that's another commonality between Egypt and Mesopotamia is that their leaders were getting some of their authority from the divine. Right, so they were saying like, okay, the gods are backing us. In Egypt, they went even farther than that and saying like, we are sent directly from the gods. That would be one of those details that you could use for the complex understanding point. So let's say that you're writing an essay about divine right kings in Europe, or you're writing an essay about China and mandate of heaven. Well, you would be able to draw a connection back to Egypt and Mesopotamia and how their leaders were claiming to have authority from their gods as well, and that's where they got a lot of their authority from. All right, so that like kind of last point on each essay, the complex understanding, it's in DBQ and LEQ point, you could draw a connection to another time period. So again, you're writing an essay about Europe and monarchs that were saying that they were divine or they had the approval of the gods. Draw a connection back to Egypt. Draw a connection back to China and mandate of heaven if you can, right? And then that's a way to make that connection. All right, and the key is not just like making the connection, but then explaining it. Right? So, the divine right kings were just like the Egyptians, their pharaohs were viewed as having the keys to the afterlife, so to speak, and they were making that direct connection with the gods. When we look at Egypt as well, like I said, there's not much conquest until latest period. And the Egyptians are actually going to be the first group of people that are going to send Jews on that diasporic life, right? So in period 1, we start to see a really, really brief emergence of monotheism. So Hebrew monotheism and Zoroastrianism. And the Egyptians are going to conquer Jerusalem where the Jews were living, and they're going to expel them. Right? And so that's going to be the first time that Jewish people have to embrace that like diasporic style. If you don't know that word diasporic, it just means where you're constantly on the move, and you just are spreading out of necessity. All right, and that's kind of a key. I'm just going to draw a box here to just illustrate some things that happen at the end of period 1. So at the end of period 1, like I said, we see the emergence of monotheism. There is a historical debate on whether Jewish or Hebrew Judaism or Zoroastrianism was first. Who was the first monotheistic faith? We know that at the tail end of period 1, there are these two faiths that emerge. In claiming that there is now only one God, which is a real big threat, right? Think about if you're the Egyptian pharaoh and you're telling your people that the gods are giving you authority to govern, and then there's this group of people saying, no, there aren't gods, there's only one true God, and that whole structure of gods is wrong. So monotheism is a really dangerous thing to appear if you're a leader that's using polytheism to justify your power. Right? And that's why in the next period, the Romans are going to be so critical of the first Christians, because Christians were threatening their power. We also see the emergence of empires right at the tail end of period 1. The Assyrians will be one of the first empires in history. They were Mesopotamians, so they were living right in the modern day Middle East, Iraq, Iran, and they spread out and they conquered other people around them. And with the emergence of an empire, we say that you governed far-flung land, whatever that means. It just means, land outside your borders and a pretty good distance is what you have to do to be an empire. We see larger populations. People are starting to get really good at agriculture, so they're able to produce more food. They're able to store more food. And the populations are really going to grow as a result of that. So that's period 1 in a nutshell. Any questions from period 1? Yeah.
Besides divine right, was there any other ways of civilizations that were leaders claiming power outside of religion?
Okay, so the I don't know if everybody heard the question was, besides divine right, how are rulers claiming power? I mean, normally rulers claim power through military force, and then to legitimize their power once they took it, they were then making that divine claim. So it's like military force got them there, and then divine right legitimized their position. And that's a way that the College Board likes to phrase that type of question, like how did rulers legitimize their power? And if you talk about the utilization of religion and the divine, in this earliest period it was the most common. So once you took power, you then had to legitimize it. Later in the course, rulers are going to legitimize power through science, and we'll talk about that development, but that's not until period 4. Hey, Dunkin' Donuts, I'm advertising for you, so if you want to send me a lifetime supply. Sorry, I'm recording, and I'm hoping to get sponsored for next school year. I mean, a guy can dream, right? Yeah?
Is there anything going on in the Americas right now with Shaman?
Yeah, so the question is there anything going on in the Americas? We see the Olmecs. There's a group of people called the Shaban that are living in modern-day Peru. But very, very small groups of people, and they're not doing nearly as much movement of water, and there's not nearly as much planting. So we kind of ignore, in a lot of ways, the Americas until we get to period 4. unfortunately, which actually really undermines like how much people in the Americas were doing. But just because the amount of impact those people were having on the rest of the world was so small, we just don't really look at them too much. So period 1, I wouldn't go too crazy worrying about the Americas. Period 2, we'll talk a little bit about the Mayans. But even the Mayans, they cross over into period 3. Okay, so I'm just going to pause to erase the board. Anybody want a picture before I do that? Does anyone want to grab a picture? Are you guys good? A picture of the board, not of me. That'd be weird.
I mean, it impacted me. Like, personally.
I brought my 50 different colored pens, and I'm maroon.
And it's like, what was driving on? Because of like, there's gender difference.
All right, so for period 2, this is where we start to kind of increase our stake in the test. And we get up to 15% of the exam for period 2. What I'm going to do first is just give you some big picture things that happened during period 2, and then give you some specifics. We'll do a Han-Rome comparison. We'll talk about some of the other details that could potentially be asked on the long essay section. Unfortunately, as we get into period 2 and 3, we'll really kind of ignore the Americas and Africa for a while. And again, it's really a notion of how much history there is to teach that we ignore the Americas and Africa. And as somebody that loves history, it makes me sad that we do that, because it really does devalue what was happening in the Americas and Africa. But we just have to look at who had like the biggest world impact, and in periods 2 and 3, it's going to be, really in Europe, really in Asia. So much love to the earliest Americans and Africans, but we're going to ignore them for a little while. So for period 2, the things that we want to know, we'll kind of hit religion first because it is going to start to have the biggest impact. So in period 2, we see the growth of monotheism. And this is going to come in the form of Christianity. So, sorry, I should have probably opened with period 2 is 600 BCE to 600 CE. So I don't know if anybody's still confused about the BCE CE split, but that would be something I would just make sure you feel comfortable with. The bigger the number BCE, the farther it was away from us, right? And then as soon as we get into the CEs, it makes a little bit more sense. So that emergence of monotheism, and specifically of Christianity, it takes about 300 years from when it starts to really take root in Europe. So we won't really start seeing a big influence from Christianity until about 300 CE. And we'll talk about, when Rome starts to embrace Christianity rather than throwing Christians to the lions, which is what they did for more than 200 years. This is also going to be the period of Confucianism in China, the rise of Buddhism, Bless you. And the establishment of a way more kind of organized and structured Hinduism.
Where was Buddhism originally?
India. So it started in India and then spread into the rest of
Same with
Asia.
Hinduism?
Yep. Yeah, and Buddhism came from a wealthy Indian priest that was just really disheartened by all the wealth around him, and he just, gave it all up and went on a quest to try to find meaning. Yeah.
Confucianism wasn't really like a set religion, right? It was just like a set of principles.
Right. And we'll talk about China. So Confucianism is more a governing principle. It's a way to kind of structure and organize society. But along with that, in China, we also saw ancestor veneration and this idea of filial piety, where people in China were really devoted to their families, and then society was really viewed as an extension of family. So these all are really China, but it's hard to talk about religions without talking about Confucianism, even though it's not really a religion in the sense of a God-driven, afterlife-driven theory, right? It's more about how do you govern, right? And Confucius was a guy that lived in China, and he wrote all about the things that he saw wrong with Chinese society. And, that's what gives us a little bit more, kind of insight into it. But yeah, they're still venerating their ancestors. They believe that their ancestors existed in the afterlife. They were able to influence this life. And we'll get to that a little bit when we get to Han China. So we see the growth of monotheism, other religions. This is also going to be the emergence of long-distance trade. So you probably know about the Silk Road. We'll talk a little bit about the Trans-Saharan trade and the Indian Ocean trade as well. So people are starting to expand the amount of territory that they're willing to cover when it comes to trade routes. You definitely want to be able to talk about some of the goods. And also just the fluctuations of those trade routes. I also have terrible handwriting, sorry for those people that don't have me normally. So if you can't read something, I see like the look of like confusion at times. Just ask and I'll tell you. I try, but my handwriting is just horrible. So our growth of monotheism, our emergence of long distance trade, and our emergence of bigger empires. Right? We're now no longer just going to be like these small civilizations with maybe 10, 20, 30,000. We're going to start to be empires that encompass millions of people. All right, so we'll definitely see, and we'll focus primarily on Rome and Han China just for the sake of time. But there are quite a bit of other things happening in this period when it comes to empire building. We'll touch really quickly on the Greeks and Alexander the Great, talk a tiny bit about Persia, but really try to spend most of our time on Rome and Han China. So the Greco-Romans are going to start to do more, kind of scientific study of the world. And so if you have been kind of working through that College Board packet, in period 2, they talk about something called Greco-Roman philosophies. And this is really talking about how they were looking at the world in a rational way. So even though they had a polytheistic religious system, there was people in Greece and Rome that were asking questions and seeking rational answers. So Plato and Socrates, Euclid, Pythagoras, these are thinkers and mathematicians that you may have heard of, and they came from the time of the Greeks. from the Greeks, we get a really good estimation of how big the Earth is. We get some ideas about maybe the fact that the Earth is not the center of the universe, but then people didn't really know how to develop that theory. So, the idea of like Columbus being the first person to think the world was not flat, the Greeks knew that the world wasn't flat, and they had a pretty good estimate on the size of the world. So if anybody's on Twitter, just hit up Kyrie Irving and tell him the world is round. No, Kyrie Irving, you don't know? Okay, that's fine. Basketball fans in the room, enjoy that joke. So let's talk about first the Greeks. So Greece at this time, kind of like Mesopotamia, was not a centralized civilization or empire. The Greeks were in city-states. And these city-states were fiercely independent, very loyal to their city, but they were all different. They had different governments, they had different economies, they had different ways of going out and conquering. And it wasn't until Greece is under attack from a group of people called the Persia that they find some reason to unify. Right? So for the Greeks, they're really fragmented until they get attacked. Our two biggest, or not biggest, but most well-known city-states in Greece are Athens and Sparta. So most people know Athens for its early democracy. They're really renowned for art and architecture. And, most people know Sparta for war. The Spartans were really brutal warriors. Right? They went through rigorous training that started, at birth. The mythology of Sparta is that when a baby was born, they would leave it outside for a set period of time to see if the baby would survive, and if it didn't, then it didn't deserve to be a Spartan. And then there was all these trials that the young Spartan warriors would go through to test their strength, and so they were really militaristic, but then that became kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way. So they were militaristic, so they went out and conquered, and then they brought back slaves, and then they had to be even more militaristic to prevent their slaves from revolting, and then they had to conquer more land to feed their big population. So we know them for being warriors, and we think that because of that they probably had this tyrannical government. But in reality, their government was actually really sensible. They had two kings. One king that managed the home front and one king that went off to war with the soldiers. And, the Spartans were really a lot more democratic in a lot of ways. They had a council of elders that advised the kings. So it's we look at Sparta in a really simplistic way. It's they were warriors and they didn't make a lot of art and they didn't leave a lot of written records, so they must have just been these barbarians. But that's a real oversimplification of what they did. So it's going to be Persia that will be the unifier for the Greek city-states, because the Empire of Persia, which was to their east, is going to come and attempt to take over the Greek city-states. And most famously, because it makes for a really good story, we focus on one battle in these Persian wars called the Battle of Thermopylae. If you've ever seen the movie 300 or have heard of that, you might know a little bit more about Sparta and the Greeks than you think. And again, the mythology goes that 300 Spartans held off 1,000,000 Persians. Maybe not quite that big of a difference, but still, we know that the Greeks were able to kind of withhold and not get taken over by Persia. So Persia was centered, in modern-day Iran and the Middle East. The Persian kings built this really vast empire. They were really centralized. they weren't centered. That's not right. Sorry. So really centralized, but then there was a governmental innovation by the Persians where they divided Persia into 20 provinces, and each province had a governor that was responsible to the king, called a satrap. So even though they were really centralized, they had these 20 provinces that had governors, and they really administered Persia in a really systematic and organized way. They had a postal system. They had royal roads that were really efficient at carrying messages. Even though we're talking about a really vast amount of territory, well over 1,000 miles, they were able to move messages in a matter of a week or two. So Persia had really kind of built the model for an efficient empire. And the Romans and the Han Chinese would have actually been smart to have studied Persia a little bit to figure out how they administered their empire. The problem for Persia, like everybody else that we've seen in history, is that they just got too greedy in terms of building their empire. Right? They wanted to take over all the Greek city-states. They put an enormous amount of energy and effort into that. And those Persian wars take place in the 480s BCE. And it just really weakened Persia. Now, there's a lot more history to this, and I'm giving you like the tiny, tiny sliver of it. Eventually, the Greek city-states will go to war with each other after that, called the Peloponnesian Wars, where they're really weakened. And that what we see in the 300s BCE is that a guy named Alexander the Great conquers everybody. And he just comes in. He was from Macedonia, which was a city that was north of Greece. He was just in love with all things Greek. And Alexander the Great goes out and in a matter of about 10 years conquers all of Greece and all the way over to the Indus River, right? Which is, if you kind of try to envision a world map in your head, Greece, that easternmost tip of Europe, all the way over to the Indus River Valley and all the land in between, that is a massive empire. Now, Alexander the Great dies in his early 30s, so he takes 10 years building this massive empire and then doesn't get to really spend any time enjoying it. But he had a desire to spread all things Greek. And we call that the Hellenistic period. And we refer to the empire that he left as the Hellenistic Empire. And it was an empire that saw kind of the fusion or mixing of Greek culture and then whatever area they were in. So one of the most kind of famous examples is that Alexander goes and he conquers Egypt. And then he leaves this kind of like blended Egyptian Greek culture. He famously builds the Library of Alexandria, right, and has all of these cities built around the world that carry his name, right? So there's Alexandrias all over the world. And, Alexander the Great, in Hellenistic culture, my guess is you would see this on like possibly a multiple choice question, not something in the long essay, but, I'm just trying to sprinkle in as much information as possible, and maybe some of it will stick and you'll be able to use it in a long essay. So I'm just going to erase over here so I can do a Han-Rome comparison. I don't know if anybody wanted to take a picture. So when we're thinking about China, their civilization goes way back into period 1. They had a group called the Shang that were kind of the first Chinese civilization. The Shang gave China the notion of mandate of heaven. Then there was a group called the Zhou, and then there was this kind of long warring states period where there was just kind of a lot of chaos in China. And that is a reoccurring theme in Chinese history, that powerful empires that fall are often followed by periods of warring states. And then it takes a really strong centralized empire to end that period of warring states. So in China, the first empire we'll actually talk about is the Qin, or Qin. Their period of ruling is not very long. The pace at which they govern China is absolutely intense and extremely brutal. The Qin were legalists. They believed that people were bad by nature, and the only way to keep people in line was to have really harsh punishments. So we won't see Confucianism as a ruling system in China until the Han will come along after. The Qin, one of the things that they do that's really beneficial is they establish the Great Wall in the north. Yep.
Is it 205 or 206?
206. Sorry. But again, the pace at which they try to conquer, they just can't maintain that long term. So ultimately the Han are going to fall, the Qin are going to fall and be replaced by the Han. And the Han are typically who would be emphasized on an essay if they were asking you to talk about China. Now, you could use all your information that you know about the Qin as really great context to that essay. So if you're coming up, if you have to compare Rome and Han China, you could talk about how the Han Chinese had this really strong foundation in place in the form of the Qin with the Great Wall and all the centralization that they did. So this information could provide context. I think that it would be really unlikely that you would get an essay question that asks you to talk about essentially 15 years of Chinese history. So when the Han come along, they move away from this notion of legalism, and this is where we see the first kind of embrace of Confucianism. In Confucianism, the idea was that government was an extension of the family, right? And the leader of the government was like the leader of a family. And if the leader governed morally, then the people would follow. Yeah?
What were the dates for home?
So 206. And then I have to consult my cheat sheet because I don't remember every date. It's in the 200s, Common Era, but I don't want to give you the wrong date. So it goes from 206 BCE to 220 CE. Say it again. 280 CE.
That's what it says on Wikipedia.
It says on Wikipedia. Freemanpedia. We can double check. There are most people look at the East and West Han. So the centralized Han is 220, and then I can't remember which one, East or West, lasts a little bit longer. But there is a part of Han that probably does go a little bit longer. I don't think that it's a huge cause of concern. It's going to be very unlikely that you're going to need a super specific date, but we could always check that. For the Han, this is a period where they did start to embrace trade a bit. Right, they were kind of one of the ends of the Silk Road. The Han's government was very centralized. And they were able to legitimize their power with that idea of mandate of heaven. Again, that was a carryover from the Shang period. So the idea that the gods had authorized the rulers to be in power, and as long as they had the support of the gods, they were going to be able to continue to govern. So for Rome, we need to know Rome in kind of different periods. In the earliest period, which is all BCE, Rome is governed by kings. You know, and there's a story of Roman mythology that says Romulus and Remus were these brothers that were raised by a she-wolf, and they were the ones that started Rome. There were essentially 7 cities in the earliest period of Rome that were all governed by individual kings. Rome was a really agricultural place where it was tough to grow things, so they had to really be, again, good at water management, good at cultivating labor. So at times those kings were a bit harsh. And by 509 there was a wealthy enough class in Rome that they were able to overthrow the kings. So during that period, that's when Rome was a republic. So during the Roman Republic, the power was held in the hands of a Senate. So Rome had a Senate. There was really a separation of power system. The Senate even had the power to name someone as dictator for a year in times of emergency. So it was really a very representative system of government in a lot of ways. But the representation was definitely skewed to the wealthy class, and there was quite a bit of infighting between the patricians, which were the wealthy Romans, and the plebeians, the poor Romans. So, yeah.
How does the government in Rome compare to Palestine? Like, I know they had the emperor and the man of heaven, but
Yep.
what about?
So during this earliest period, the period of the Republic, the way that they govern is really different. They're still centralized, but there's no king. There's a Senate that has that centralized power.
What about China?
So
In Han China.
in Han China, they're really centralized. They have one emperor that legitimizes their power with mandate of heaven.
Okay.
So if you were going to get a question, and this is where actually, I can't remember, it was either 2011 or 12, I was teaching AP World at the time, and there was a question about Imperial Rome, and compare and contrast the government of Imperial Rome to the government of Han China. And some of my students came out and they were so excited that they wrote this really great essay about the Roman Republic and the Senate and all this stuff. And I mean, the imperial period is once Rome becomes an empire, right? So you want to really think about the dates before you start writing an essay, because if you write all about the Roman Republic and they give you a date of 27 CE and beyond, then you've just written the wrong essay, unfortunately. So we will make sure that we have that idea and a little bit more understanding. So from 27 CE to 476, we have the Roman Empire. So the idea of an empire really started with Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar had told the people of Rome, like, look, forget about this Senate, which has become extremely corrupt, and empower me to lead you guys with total power. Right? And Julius Caesar was really the first leader of Rome that was able to convince the people that essentially dictatorship in the long term would work. Now, Julius Caesar was only in power for 40 plus days before he got killed by a bunch of senators who were not happy about losing power. Right? So it took a little while for the Romans to figure out how to have an empire. But when they're in the period of empire, they are very centralized. So their government is managing over a big military. There is an expression that all roads lead to Rome. that expression came from the fact that the Roman government managed over this massive road construction project where they wanted roads to connect all parts of their empire so they could more effectively trade. So they were really good at building roads, at least for a while. At the later period, they kind of start to neglect some of what got them, that big empire. But the really cool thing is if you go to Rome right now and you walk around the city, you are walking on, in some cases, 2,000-year-old roads. So like I-4, they have to repave it every 2 months. Roman roads made it 2,000 years. So when we think about our comparisons between Rome and Han China, centralized, building a big military, having these big technological projects, those are definitely some comparisons. The earliest Romans, they legitimized power with their polytheism, right? And the Roman emperors claimed to have a divine link. The Romans are an empire, they're conquerors, and they go on this unbelievable pace of conquest that puts them into a pretty epic conflict with a group of people called another empire called Carthage. Some of the most interesting, cool battles in history were fought between the Romans and the people of Carthage. But ultimately the Romans were able to conquer land all around the Mediterranean. So northern Africa, into the westernmost part of Asia, with modern-day Jerusalem, a huge chunk of Europe, even all the way up to England at one point. So the Romans just have this huge, expansive empire. And that's kind of a commonality between the Han Chinese and the Romans, is that they both build these huge, massive empires, which are really difficult to manage. And the Chinese and the Romans, they both start dealing with invaders from their northern borders. For the Chinese, it's not yet the Mongols. Please don't say Han China fell because of the Mongols. If you say that, you're only off by 1,000 years. So, but there is a group of people invading China from the north, but not the Mongols, right? They are called the Xiong Yu, and I'm so sorry, Xiong Yu people out there, because I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. And I'm probably spelling it wrong as well. So if you are an ancestor of the ancient Xiong Yu Chinese, please, I think it's Xiongu. But I could be wrong on spelling and pronunciation. At least I'm not oh wait. Alright, so for Rome, they also begin to get attacked. But Rome, the problems are really as much internal as external. Again, I talked a little bit about how there was a problem between the wealthy and the poor. We also see in Rome the rise of Christianity. And Christianity presents a problem to the Roman emperors. Here they had a divine connection to the polytheistic gods who were legitimizing their power, but now you had an increasingly large amount of Christians. So it's how do you resolve the fact that you have Christians in your empire, but you're trying to say that you're divine, right? And ultimately, an emperor named Constantine is going to just say, well, you know what? I'm just going to become a Christian. And my empire is going to become an empire of Christians. So the earliest Christians in Rome were really persecuted by the emperors, right? The term martyr was, Christians that lost their lives fighting for what they believed in. But by the 300s Common Era and 323 CE specifically, this becomes the state religion of Rome. Now, the earliest Christians in Rome were fiercely monotheistic. But then other people that started to kind of embrace Christianity were a little bit less concerned with being fiercely monotheistic, and there was definitely a bit of that blending of Christianity with the polytheism. And eventually we'll start to see in the western part of Rome the formation of a Catholic Church led by a pope who's really going to try to crack down on some of those polytheistic elements that Christians, in quotes, were carrying. All right, so Rome, they're having problems from within. They're having the growth of Christianity. They're being invaded from the outside. And finally, by 476, Western Rome falls. All right, so Rome will then kind of shift over to the east. The eastern part of the Roman Empire will become the Byzantine Empire, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in the transition into period 3. So we have 220 CE that the centralized Chinese fall, 476 CE Western Rome falls, leaving Western Europe in a state of feudalism, which we'll talk a little bit about as we get into period 3. All right, what period 2 questions could I answer? I'm trying to stay about a half an hour on each period, so that way I could, try to get you guys out as close to 12 as possible. Yeah.
Are the 12 tables important to know, like when it comes to the?
So the 12 tables were the compromise between the plebeians and the patricians. So the poor Romans went into a period of revolt, and the wealthy Romans said, okay, well, what we're going to do is we're going to write down a law code for you. So that way, at least you have an established law code. Right? So the 12 tables was that established law code. I mean, is it important? It could be. I could see maybe you getting a multiple choice question that is like an excerpt of like that law code. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep. Yeah, go ahead, Joseph.
How open were the Han to trade?
So the Han were definitely pretty open to trade. They were similar to the Tang in that they saw value in goods coming from the outside. That doesn't stop the Chinese from still treating their merchant class pretty poorly during the Han period. Right? They still look down on merchants, but this is definitely a period where they are involved in a bigger trade network. Shadeen?
Okay, was religion the cause of the fall of the Western Rome?
Well, I think that the embracing of Christianity was a factor. Was it the factor? No. I mean, they were overexpanded. Their government had become corrupt and couldn't really collect taxes and have their military anymore. But it was definitely a factor because it undermined a little bit of that legitimacy the emperors had before. Yeah? I'm sorry, you gotta say that louder. Yeah, so the Romans conquered Judea, which was, essentially modern-day Jerusalem, after the Jews had returned from their diaspora that was caused by the Egyptians. At first, the Romans kind of just left Judea alone. They paid their taxes, but eventually Rome was going to conquer Judea and, expel Jews again. So, Jews have kind of this succession of times where they're expelled from their homeland. Yeah.
Was the West and East always split?
No, so until an emperor named Diocletian, and I think it was 380, but I'll double check the year, until Diocletian came along, Rome was one. And then Diocletian's idea was, okay, Western Rome is being attacked, so what if we divided the empires in half, and the West manages itself, and the East manages itself, and it will just be easier to manage? So there wasn't always that split in Rome.
And then how did it become Byzantine?
Well, once Western Rome falls, the center of Eastern Rome was in the city of Byzantium.
Oh, okay.
So then we just call them, as historians, a Byzantine Empire to differentiate them from the Roman Empire. Yeah, go ahead, Jade.
For the Confucianism, for the you wrote on that side. Is the filial piety? I don't know how to say that.
Filial piety, yeah.
That. Is it like, was that like a way of government or something?
No, so filial piety was just the idea that you needed to treat your family, like piety means like almost religiously. So people would worship their ancestors once they had died as a way to keep them going in the afterlife. So filial piety was more like respect and reverence for your family, and then that connected more to ancestor veneration than anything.
So was that like that was like a part of the religion for Confucianism?
I mean, Confucianism is again more of that philosophy on how to govern. It's like there are kind of multiple things going on in China that are somewhat connected but not completely interconnected. So I wouldn't tell you that as one part of Confucianism you have filial piety, but as one part of China you have Confucianism and another part filial piety and ancestor veneration. Yeah?
Is there anything we should know about the Mauryan?
So the question is, should you know anything about India? The Mauryan and Gupta? I mean, generally when they give a comparative question, they give you 3 choices. Would it be bad to know about the Mauryan or Gupta? It wouldn't be, but for the sake of this, I just kind of edited that out and gave you 2. You know, the difficulty with India is that the governments and the empires don't last long, right? India is very hard to govern in a centralized way. So those periods of rule of India in this earliest point, they're really short-lived. I would, if I were you at this point, I would probably put my attention to knowing Han and Rome really well. And I think that that will cover you if there's that essay. If there's a Gupta essay, you could trip me in the hallway or something. But remember, in the long essay, you always have 3 choices, right? There's 3 long essays to choose from. And even within those essays, there's a lot of open-ended questions to them. So I feel comfortable telling you to really understand Han and Rome. Okay, why don't we take just like a quick couple-minute break. If anyone needs a bathroom, I'll unlock the bathrooms, and I'll erase the board, and we'll start on period 3.